time to cancel or suspend all of Elon Musk's government contracts and subsidies. SpaceX, NASA, StarLink, Tesla's, all of it. It was already $15 billion by just April of last year. The number's not gone down since then. The Department of Justice must also initiate efforts to get that money back because Musk is coordinating with Trump to interfere in FEMA recovery efforts post-Hurricane Helene by spreading life-threatening disinformation. And he's also coordinating a political campaign with Trump, which at its heart has Trump advocating for the overthrow of the duly elected government of the United States of America by violence if necessary. And if all of that is somehow insufficient to reinvestigate and or change Musk's immigration status here in order to deport him back to South Africa or Canada or wherever, if that is insufficient to take all of his money from him through the courts, it certainly is not insufficient to tie him up in court cases for the rest of his goddamned life. After Musk's mincing, effete performance on stage, leaping and bouncing behind Trump at Butler, Pennsylvania on Saturday, I don't know about you, but I have had enough of this idiot. And more importantly, I have had enough of us underwriting this idiot as he immorally transforms the Twitter X platform he owns into a massive donation in kind to Trump's campaign of lies, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, Nazism, hatred, fascism, and worst of all, stupidity. A donation in kind, by the way, which the government must value at $44 billion, not the current number Musk has driven it down to, which I haven't actually checked today, but is probably around $50-60. Oh, and President Biden, the StarLink equipment and the network behind it, and the rockets and the satellite access and the actual platform hosting X or what's left of it, seize it. If Musk wants it back, let him go to court. If he tries to shut it off, arrest him for tampering with evidence in a criminal case. Remember, presidential immunity. By the way, Musk's new good buddy Trump doesn't know what the hell StarLink is.
They said, could you do us a favor? Could you help us? We're trying to get StarLink, and it's very hard to get. Most people say you can't even get it. I called up Elon. I said, North Carolina's in big trouble. Georgia's in big trouble. They need communication. They have none because their poles have been knocked down and their wires are underwater and even dangerously underwater, but they have no communication. Elon, could you do something about StarLink, whatever the hell that is, Elon? Whatever StarLink, that's all they want to hear is StarLink.
Incidentally, numerous right-wing social media accounts posted that photo of Musk leaping like all the ketamine had kicked in all at once behind a clearly annoyed Trump. You know, that photo with Musk's belly flopping out? Lauded by the far right. This, wrote the infamous hate-monger behind libs of TikTok, is going to go down in history as one of the most consequential images of the 2024 election. You bet your ass. As the cliche goes, I'm old enough to remember when libs of TikTok stochastically directed terroristic threats at men with bare midriffs and other men wearing makeup who were on stage prancing together in front of an audience. Oh, and while we're at this, charge Musk's mother, too, for conspiracy to commit election fraud. She retweeted her son's post about voting and added, quote, the Democrats have given us another option. You don't have to register to vote. On Election Day, have 10 fake names. Go to 10 polling booths and vote 10 times. That's 100 votes, and it's not illegal. Maybe we should work the system, too. Well, first of all, madam, congratulations on the math. You are correct. 10 fake names, 10 polling booths, 10 times. By the way, shut up. You've done enough to destroy the planet, madam. You birthed this jackanapes. I mean, it sounds comical at first, except it's true. All the James Bond and other spy movies of the 60s and 70s begin with a psychopathic billionaire who owns space rockets and communication systems. We used to have places where people like Trump and his family and Musk and his mother used to be able to get the care that could benefit, even save anybody in their condition. Now, instead, we let them run for president. By the way, if you don't think part of Musk prostituting himself for Trump is some thought in that brain of his, fighting for space in there with all the hallucinogens, that Trump will make it possible for naturalized American citizens who were not born here to serve as president, even though the Constitution says otherwise, you know it's in there. Musk thinks Musk can succeed Trump. As they used to say, depend upon it, sir. Quote, Trump's speeches, increasingly angry and rambling, reignite the question of age. With the passage of time, the 78-year-old former president's speeches have grown darker, harsher, longer, angrier, less focused, more profane, and increasingly fixated on the past, according to a review of his public appearances over the years. Yes, that actually was in the New York Times. Not the New York Times. Not The Onion. This just in, Trump is rambling. Breaking news from Peter Baker, hot off the presses. If you consider leading the Times' first serious story about Trump's dementia with an anecdote that is now 28 days old, hot off the presses. Former President Donald J. Trump vividly recounted how the audience at his climactic debate with Vice President Kamala Harris was on his side, except that there was no audience. The debate was held in an empty hall. No one, quote, went crazy, as Mr. Trump put it, because no one was there. Even to be generous, Trump's hallucination about there having been an audience at that debate was from September 18th. The debate itself was September 10th. These days, that is approximately 9,000 election news cycles ago. And the Times piece, while to be welcomed as a sign that the Times knows it has effed up, knows it has damaged itself, knows that it has showed both its ass and its arrogance, knows that it's now October. The piece only borders on the reality of the Trump cognitive crisis for 3 paragraphs before passing the buck. Quote, according to a computer analysis by the New York Times, Mr. Trump's rally speeches now last an average of 82 minutes, compared to 45 minutes in 2016. Proportionately, he uses 13% more all-or-nothing terms like always and never than he did 8 years ago, which some experts consider a sign of advancing age. Unquote. Oh, my God! Computer analysis! We're not saying this. The computer is saying this. Ugh. Quote, it was hardly the only time Mr. Trump has seemed confused, forgetful, incoherent, or disconnected from reality lately. In fact, it happens so often these days that it no longer even generates much attention. As the great journalist and historian Rick Perlstein wrote, one of the most abiding failures of agenda-setting elite political journalism is its denial of its own agency. Trump's manner of speaking, quote, no longer generates much attention, as if Trump himself generates what the Times decides to attend to, not the Times. Yes, sir. It's Trump no longer generating attention the way Hurricane Helene is no longer generating catastrophic winds. Way down in paragraph 17, we finally get some human assessment. Again, not by the Times. Oh, we're just reporting with the help of computers. It's not us. It's not Peter Baker. It's not anybody you could sue. It's not anybody you could imprison. It's others. Quote, how much is rambling discourse, what some experts call tangentiality, can be attributed to age is the subject of some debate. Mr. Trump has always had a distinctive speaking style that entertained and captivated supporters, even as critics called him detached from reality. Indeed, questions have been raised about Mr. Trump's mental fitness for years. John F. Kelly, his second White House chief of staff, was so convinced that Mr. Trump was psychologically unbalanced that he bought a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, written by 27 mental health professionals to try to understand his boss better. As it was, Mr. Kelly came to refer to Mr. Trump's White House as, quote, crazy town, unquote. That, of course, is still no reason for us at the Times to acknowledge that Trump is crazy or brain damaged or a madman or criminally effing insane. And it is certainly not sufficient for us at the holy goddamn New York Times to utilize four-letter words with which to describe his falsehoods and other inaccuracies. Four-letter words like lies. Okay, I could literally go on for the length of the article, but I think you get my point. Only the Times could write a piece about Trump's mental self-disqualification from the presidency while managing to still both sides the damn thing, albeit with one of the sides being crazy and the other side being senile. Maybe that's what took them so long to write it. The point is, they wrote it, and it reflects two things. So many people inside this country's newsrooms and outside this country's borders take their journalistic cues from the New York Times and have taken them for so long that they don't even know anymore that their response to the Times is virtually Pavlovian. That article is likely to produce commentaries and pieces and just openness to finally addressing this issue with results that will settle everywhere from A to Z along the spectrum of the emperor has no brain. It's terrible the Times has that influence, especially when they have used it so badly for so long. But somebody at the BBC right now is preparing his or her own version of that New York Times piece. Same at the Times of India and the Himalayan Times in Nepal. The second important part here is that working the refs works. It works. It works. It works. I mean, maybe if we keep kicking the editor in the ass publicly, the New York Times will correct his last mistake and put out a 10-day long, page one, upper left-hand corner series analyzing Jack Smith's evidence against Trump in a real sort of play-by-play. This is what Jack Smith thinks happened on January 6th and the weeks before, analyzing the evidence that was released last week, something they could run every day between now and the election, like Hillary's emails. Because working the refs works. A lot more on working the refs and my own experience with it in a moment. But first, happily, there remains countless numbers of media folks here who still don't or won't get it. CBS Evening News, Saturday. Anchor Jericka Duncan throws to reporter Caitlin Huey Burns in Butler, Pennsylvania for Trump's latest hateful fascist rally, the one Musk was at. I'm Elon Musk. Watch me bounce. And the last words of the anchor's introduction, the last words Jericka Duncan says are, quote, Trump began with a unifying message, unquote. Yeah, unifying. You will bow down before me. That kind of unifying. Of course, our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying media managed to both sides it again. It's not just about miscovering Trump. Kamala Harris's interview schedule this week so far, 60 Minutes last night, Howard Stern Tuesday, The View Tuesday, Colbert Tuesday, Univision Town Hall Thursday. The reaction from Andrea Mitchell about this scheduling and about the Harris campaign when she was on Meet the Press yesterday, I think they've got to double down on more interviews and serious interviews. By serious, Andrea means Harris should do an interview with her on her little midday MSNBC, I'm just going to stay here till they finally fire me show, or Andrea's going to continue to go on NBC and whine. What I'm hearing from Democratic and Republican business people She means her husband, Alan Greenspan. And a lot of men, there's an undercount of the Trump vote. I think there was miscegenation. Miscegenation. Yes, she said miscegenation. She got about to the n. She got to the n. Miscegenation. And then she realized what she was saying. Miscegenation is race mixing. Good point about Kamala Harris, Andrea. Miscegenation. Well done. Mitchell hurriedly switched to, quote, miscegenation in all of this. There is no such word as miscegenation. Did you mean something about misogyny, Andrea? And then you followed it up with, quote, black and white men, big problem. But also the business world, they don't think she's serious. They don't think she's a heavyweight. And I tell you what, I don't think Andrea Mitchell slipped when she at first said miscegenation. She should be fired. Then there's Politico. Excuse me, I forgot to recognize its German ownership here. Das Politico. Don't call it a media blitz. After avoiding the media for nigh on her whole campaign, VP Kamala Harris is still largely avoiding the media. Let's be real here. Most of these are not the types of interviews that are going to press her on issues she may not want to talk about, even as voters want more specifics from Harris. Instead, expect most of these sit-downs to be a continuation of the vibes campaign Harris has perfected. We're not saying there's no value in these. 60 Minutes and the Univision Town Hall are sure to be substantive. Each of these shows has millions of viewers or listeners, especially women and young voters, key constituencies for Harris. Let me translate this. Politico believes it's more substantive than 60 Minutes and Univision Town Hall, and also, what else? The View and my old friend Howard, and what else? Everything else in the world. Politico is more important. And Politico will continue to accuse Harris of avoiding interviews until she does an interview with the news outlet that Politico considers the gold standard, namely Politico. Das Politico. Mein Politico. Happily, Politico followed this childish 7-year-old's diatribe with one of the greatest self-owns of the century. But forgive me, I'm going to tease that in hopes that you will take the next 2.5 minutes to listen to the appearance, just a small part of it, on a podcast by Kamala Harris that Politico mocked, and Politico self-owned by mocking it. The podcast is called Call Her Daddy. It is a giant in the field. Politico insulted its host, Alex Cooper. The interview was 45 minutes of actual questions, not attempts to play gotcha or grab a headline that reads, Harris tells Politico exclusively. Listen for the substance. Stay for the Politico faceplant.
I do want to clarify something. In the debate, former President Trump claimed that some states are executing babies after birth. Can you just clarify?
That is not happening anywhere in the United States. It is not happening, and it's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie that he is suggesting that. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? He is suggesting that women in their 9th month of pregnancy are electing to have an abortion. Are you kidding? That is so outrageously inaccurate, and it's so insulting to suggest that that would be happening and that women would be doing that. It's not happening anywhere. This guy is full of lies. I mean, I just have to be very candid with you. So in my career, from the time I got out of law school through most of my career as a prosecutor, I understood that the words that I spoke and what I did with those words would be the difference between whether somebody was charged with a crime or went to prison, maybe prison for life. When I was Attorney General, I was the top law enforcement officer of the biggest state in this country. And I was acutely aware that the words I spoke could be the difference between whether a corporation was in business or out of business, that the words I spoke could move markets. The idea that someone is not only so careless and irresponsible and reckless, but out and out lies to create fear and division in our country, and thinks he should be president of the United States standing behind the seal of the president of the United States using the microphone that comes with that, and using that voice and those words in such an irresponsible, and that's mild, way. And this is why this election matters.
I mean, that's the whole election in 2.5 minutes. The other 42.5 minutes are nearly as good. Wherever you podcast, call her daddy. This is what Politico wrote about Kamala Harris going on the Call Her Daddy podcast. Quote, recent episodes of Call Her Daddy, just for a touch point, were titled Is He the One? And Blowjobs, Hall Passes, and Frat Daddies. Unquote. So it's inappropriate or somehow a touch point that Call Her Daddy has had sexual content lately, Politico? One quick question, Politico. Who was that political writer and editor and where did he work again? Who was just accused by his ex-fiancée of hacking her phone and leaking details of her sex life to other news outlets and trying to blackmail her into more sex and not leaving their relationship? Oh, right. That was Ryan Lizza who was accused of that. Of Politico. Editor of Politico Playbook. And you haven't fired him, despite his record of having been fired by the New Yorker for something sexual. So, Politico, one more question. The Call Her Daddy podcast you don't like Vice President Harris doing, is the problem that it has too much sex or that it has not as much sex as Politico Playbook does? Also of interest here, back to working the refs and the startling truth lurking inside the disasters, inside even the biggest newspapers like the New York Times. I can tell you from personal experience that sometimes it turns out the editors of the biggest newspapers in the world do not actually read what is in their own newspapers. That's next. This is Countdown. So, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit more on working the refs and the New York Times piece yesterday in which, this just in, Trump apparently hasn't been making a lot of sense recently in his speeches. I know. One can envision a conversation somewhere where they decide whether or not to devote reporters and resources and graphics, especially graphics. The New York Times is enamored of graphics as if they were just invented, where they decide whether or not to do this finally, and whether or not perhaps some of the criticism that they might hear just in the distance coming in faintly from outside in the real world might be valid. The theory of working the refs. Say, Buffy was telling me the other night that Trump hasn't been sounding good. Is that right? Well, I haven't actually heard him speak since, let's see, when was that New York Post sports breakfast, 1983? He sounded okay then. That was 41 years ago. How time flies. That's one theory of what happened at the New York Times. The other theory is that after months and months and months and months and months and months and years and years and years of criticizing the New York Times for how it handled first Hillary Clinton's emails, the entire issue of the Trump candidacy in 2016, the entire Trump presidency, especially the campaign of 2020, and Joe Biden in 2024, in which whatever claims they might have thought they had proved about Joe Biden's public capacity or willingness to do an interview or willingness to put himself at risk as there was some kind of decline in his ability to speak extemporaneously in public. Whatever they thought they had, they thought they were justified in trying to bury the president of the United States alive, even if it meant getting Donald Trump elected again and ending democracy. And by the way, ending the free press and the New York Times. And one of the things that I probably alone thought of, no one else would have made this analogy because it's an experience from my own life and nobody else's. There's one person to whom this might have occurred, a man named Bob Costas, who I have invoked here before, who I once told to shut the F up on this very topic. Bob did not end his friendship with me over that. We had a long talk about it, and I tried to explain to Bob why that was the wrong time to do what he wanted to do, and that later was actually better, and I think it will prove later was actually better. But I'm straying off the topic here because the topic is working the refs when it comes to the newspapers. This is about working the refs in an entirely different context and sincerely in an entirely different meaning level. If the stuff in the New York Times finally getting around to Trump's mental capacity or incapacity is a 1,000, my story is a 2. However, my story is a first-hand story. I can tell you the whole thing, and it's a doozy. I got to Los Angeles as a local TV sportscaster at the age of 26 on Labor Day 1985. I just happened to hit the clouds right with my Marjorie Taylor Greene, you know they can control the weather, cloud seeding effort. I, in 3 months, became the second or third most popular sportscaster on television in Los Angeles. Quite a role reversal because I literally could not get employment the year before after a very unfortunate series of experiences in Boston. So I got the Associated Press Sportscaster of the Year award for California and I think also Nevada. So I wasn't even working in Nevada, and I was the Sportscaster of the Year in Nevada as well. And I got the UPI award for the same thing, and I won a Golden Mike, and all of these accolades inside of 3 months. And on Christmas Day, back when LA had 2 daily metropolitan big-scale newspapers, the Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, so big that even in 1985, they each had full-time columns devoted just to TV sports and principally devoted to TV local sports. The 2 columnists both wrote their year-end stories for 1985. Bob Kaiser in the LA Herald-X, the Herald-Examiner, wrote that I was the best sportscaster in town, a breath of fresh air, and all the other things you would say about me if you can envision me being 26 years old and my style being almost brand new and certainly brand new in Los Angeles. Larry Stewart, the TV sports columnist of the Los Angeles Times, wrote on the same day that I was the worst sportscaster who had ever worked in LA, and what was worse, somebody had told me I was funny. These 2 pieces next to each other defined for me proof that the theory that you can't be all things to all people at the same time was wrong. LA Herald-Examiner, worst or best sportscaster we've ever had, best sportscaster we have right now. LA Times, worst of all time. Mr. Stewart continued on this vein for quite some time. I don't remember how it was that I personally ticked him off, but I did. I may have said something to somebody at the Los Angeles Times after the 6th or 7th or 8th article that he wrote in 1986 suggesting that I was going to be fired by Channel 5, my employers, when I had a 3-year contract, and Channel 5 really could not afford to fire me and pay me at the same time. They didn't have that kind of money. I may have complained and said, what are you guys doing? Then I began to notice that he was saving, Larry Stewart was, the worst of his insults towards me for things like my birthday, major holidays, other stuff like that. One day, I reported that Wayne Gretzky had been traded to the Los Angeles Kings. His take was that I had guessed correctly and shouldn't get any credit for breaking the story. This was the sort of thing I had put up with through 3 years. Then I went to KCBS, another station in Los Angeles. And I can't remember now, in retrospect, what it was that finally ticked me off, except perhaps a rumor that I had heard that another sportscaster in Los Angeles was literally bribing Larry Stewart. Never proved it, tried, didn't succeed. I heard it from more than one person then, more than one person after I left local news in Los Angeles at the end of 1991. I have heard it as recently as earlier this year. I cannot swear that it's true. I mention it only for the context of whatever it was that drove me to write a note to Bill Dwyer, the, I might say, nationally respected sports editor of the Los Angeles Times, who retired from that role several years later and continued to contribute to the Times through the last decade, I believe, as a infrequent columnist, a good writer, a good man. I had met him once very briefly. He said he was a viewer, and in desperation, at a time when one did not take on the press face to face if you were in radio or TV, because, as the old saying goes, never pick a fight with a newspaper man. He has much more ink than you do. And it's one thing for somebody to be, in that context, critical of a newspaper man on television. It's ephemeral. You say it, and 7 seconds later, most of the audience doesn't remember what you say. If I went on the air and said Larry Stewart of the LA Times sucks, who's going to remember? Larry Stewart's going to remember. The Los Angeles Times is going to remember. They're going to write an article about me every week that way. And that is the way most of American newspaperdom, especially on the fringes. I mean, the TV sports columnist is not one of the top 500 employees in a newspaper, not even in those halcyon days when they had them in almost all major newspapers in the country. But the grudge will be then permanent. It's how much punishment are you willing to take? If it's not that much, you get out of the business. At least that was the mindset in the 1980s. So I wrote Dwyer a note saying, this latest article, which I believe prophesied that I would be fired when I was 6 months into a no-cut 3.5-year contract that owed me something like $2 million. So in other words, if they fired me, the CBS employers that I was working for then would have had to pay me $2 million. Rather than spend the $2 million and have me kill off 4 minutes a show on each of their newscasts. CBS then and now is always going to choose that latter option. Unless you are totally out of your mind and they would be in first place without you, they will pay you, but only to keep working. When I finally did leave CBS, when they finally did not pick up my option, they gave me 3 months' notice and said, of course, we want you to continue to stay on here and do the newscast every night. Of course they did. They even sent me to cover the Magic Johnson HIV announcement. They trusted me with basically a full day live programming because they were already paying me. In any event, I am wandering away from the subject again. I wrote Bill Dwyer a note in desperation. It was polite. It was addressed to Mr. Dwyer, and it said, look, this has been going on long enough. He is making things up. To my surprise, I got a phone call from Bill Dwyer about a week later saying, hey, I got your note. I didn't want you to think I'm neglecting it. I don't think there's anything to it, but I watch you every night, and I have a totally different opinion of you than Larry Stewart does. And I think I owe you, as somebody who's been here for a few years now and has not made a big deal about Larry's comments about you, I think I owe you a quick review of what he's doing. So I'm going to go back and read all of his columns, and I don't expect to find anything. I'm not going to take any action against him. I just wanted you to know I was doing it. Well, even then, it seemed to me that this was an okay kind of show of respect. It was not an admission of anything being wrong. It was not saying, look, we at the Los Angeles Times dropped the ball here, or I, as the sports editor of the Los Angeles Times, dropped the ball. It was just something. Rather than ignoring it, rather than saying you're an idiot, rather than printing my letter in the paper, which was one suggestion that somebody made, write a letter to the editor. We'll publish your letter to the editor about Larry. Like, just what I need. In any event, the phone call ended. It didn't last very long. And about a week and a half later, the phone rang again, and it was Bill Dwyer, and I did not recognize his voice. His demeanor was utterly different. Keith, Bill Dwyer from the LA Times. I finished my review of what Stewart has written of you. I'm very sorry. I'd like to take you to dinner to talk about remedies. Would you be willing to sit down with me? I was so startled by this, I just said, sure. How about tomorrow night? I'll come to you. The restaurant across the street from CBS, the Columbia Grill. Sure. What time's convenient? Now I'm thinking, well, maybe I should play with him and say 8 a.m. I picked the time after the 6 o'clock news was over. I said, 7? 7 it is. We'll see you then. The reservation will be in my name. My apologies. The dinner the next night was one of the rare ones in which I actually had time to eat and digest my food. Bill Dwyer spent easily 45 minutes apologizing on behalf of himself and his sports department and the Los Angeles Times. And after years of trying to work that ref nicely at a distance, he said something that I believe is relevant to all those who ever have a criticism of a newspaper. Sometimes, believe it or not, the people in charge know only what the people who work for them say about what is in the paper. They have not, despite the fact that you would think this would be the first thing they would do, read everything in the newspaper. They have not even, as Bill Dwyer explained, he did not read everything that was in the Los Angeles Times. Between you and me, Larry doesn't get paid for this. He works in the makeup department. He helps us lay out the pages of the sports section. We send him every once in a while to cover some high school football games, and, we throw him kind of a fee for that. But his contract is as a layout person. Well, I stifled my laughter because I wanted to hear where he was going with this story. The rest of it was the column that he wrote 2 or 3 times a week about TV sports was basically done for free. I did not even ask how they got this past the Newspapermen's Union, but they did somehow. He explained that he thought Larry Stewart was probably the worst writer who had ever appeared in the Los Angeles Times, and that they did this just because, for years, the L.A. Herald-Examiner, before it went out of business in, I believe, 1987 or 88, had a very good TV sports columnist named Bob Kaiser, and there was an excellent one at the L.A. Daily News named Phil Rosenthal. And they were ashamed that they didn't have their own TV sports columnist, and there wasn't enough money in the budget for it. They rather cover local high school sports. And then they found this marvelous opportunity. And he said, I'm realizing now we have gotten what we paid for. And I did, at this point, having small responsibilities as the sports editor or sports director of Channel 2 in Los Angeles, I needed to talk to an actual sports editor about this. I said, I don't understand. There are very few major editorial decisions that I input myself into that are not directly parts of the script right in front of me, but every once in a while I have to be involved in somebody else's work on a show I'm not doing and issue either instructions or assignments or don't cover that or make sure you cover this or emphasize that. I don't think it happens every month, but maybe every 6 weeks. I know you must have this daily. You're the sports editor. How could you not know what's in the column? I can't bear to read it. So I'm feeling a little bit better about myself here, but he said, I read everything he has written about you in the paper. I went into our morgue, the archives, and read in these pre-internet days. I read everything he wrote about you. There is the same pattern that you described about him attacking you on major holidays and your birthday and always finding some way to do something negative about you and to predict. He has reported 23 different times that you were about to be fired. This is not possible. How many times were you about to be fired? I went, maybe once. He said, my God. He said, I made a terrible mistake. I left that column and a couple of others in the hands of 2 deputy sports editors of the LA Times. 2 of them were responsible for Stewart's content. I have now demoted them both. They are now, I forget the title, but it was basically assistant copy editor of the sports section of the Los Angeles Times. And I told Stewart that if he writes anything else about you ever again, it must go to my desk. In fact, I want him to come into my office and read it to me aloud before he publishes it. Stewart, of course, worked around this by never mentioning me again for the length of my time as a local sportscaster in Los Angeles. Later on, he had no choice but to mention me because I was at ESPN, and then, in fact, working in Los Angeles on Fox Sports. and he managed to find ways long after Bill Dwyer had retired as sports editor to try to take shots at me. The punchline to this was, one of the many punchlines, was that Bill Dwyer said that I was not only totally correct, but that if I had made any mistakes, it was not telling him sooner that this had happened. Go to the boss in the situation in which you're dealing with a newspaper that has decided, or part of it has decided, to enact vengeance or bias against someone or something or somebody particularly connected to us. You're not in exactly the same business that we are, but we all cover sports in Los Angeles. You deserve better respect than that. You should have come to me sooner. It's the only time he got anywhere near defensive about what had happened. And I said, well, I'll remember to do that again, although I don't like to work the refs. And he shouted, "Work the refs. It works." 2 punchlines. I said there was just one. There are, in fact, 3. If the name Greta Gerwig means anything to you, I believe the Academy Award-winning director of Barbie and an actress also in her own right, and writer of Barbie and other film works, Larry Stewart's niece. That was a surprise. And the punchline of all punchlines. I had assumed when I left local news in Los Angeles at the end of 1991 that Larry Stewart had no greater enemy in the business than myself. 6 years later, 7 years later, I guess, I went to work at NBC Sports, had the privilege of working on baseball broadcasts with Bob Uecker and Joe Morgan and Jim Gray and Bob Costas and me. We were the World Series team in 1997. Hannah Storm and I did the pregame show together as well, and I was in the dugout for the Cleveland Indians during that World Series. The 1998 American League playoffs, I was in the dugout for Cleveland throughout that series with the Yankees and did the pre- and post-game shows then, too. As we left Cleveland for Newark, I believe in the middle of the series, as we were taxiing down the runway, I was seated next to my friend Bob Costas. This is, I think, October 1998. And I said something as we began to lift off the ground at the airport in Cleveland. I said, "So, did you see what Larry Stewart wrote the other day?" And Bob looked at me as if he was going to kill me and everybody connected to Larry Stewart. "You know Larry Stewart." There was a different voice, not the Bob Costas voice that we've heard for many years. "You know Larry Stewart?" I said I was his victim for many years. I've got a great story about him. "Let me tell you a story about him first." We landed in Newark, New Jersey. I want to say about an hour and a half later. Those who know that flight could probably correct me and give me an exact time. But it was about an hour and a half, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. And as we touched down, as we heard that little as your wheels satisfactorily hit the runway and you have survived another flight, Bob said, "Okay, that's my story. Now you can tell your Larry Stewart story." I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. That's absolutely true. Greta Gerwig is the niece of the former TV sports columnist of the Los Angeles Times, Larry Stewart. And I didn't tell you half the stories about Larry Stewart. Anywho, work the refs. That's the lesson. I don't know if that's what caused the New York Times takeout on Trump's insanity. I don't know if that's why we will be now inundated with articles of that sort and pieces of that sort by the news organizations from around the world that treat the New York Times as if it were the final authority on everything rather than a bunch of guys named Biff. In any event, thanks for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week, posting nightly just after midnight Eastern. Once again, there's a Monday countdown as you are listening to it now. You will have noticed it's a little shorter than the other ones. Give me a break. Please send this podcast to somebody who does not know they need to listen but should, especially anybody who's not a fan of Larry Stewart. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. The story was that at all press conferences, Mr. Stewart would bring a bag and take food home with him. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. I mean, I've walked out of a press conference with a little extra sandwich or something. Well, we're talking about a 3-day supply. That was the story I was told. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. I mean, if you want to say I'm not funny or not good at it, you have the right to do that. That's a columnist's job. You can't make stories up, and that's what the guy who edited the LA Times sports section said Larry did. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed, and everything else was, as usual, pretty much my fault. Ask Larry Stewart. Honest to goodness, I don't even remember if I got my Bob Costas rebuttal in there after Bob finished his hour-and-a-half-long story about Larry Stewart. He did not like Larry Stewart in a way that made it look like Larry and I were, I don't know, attached twins. That's Countdown for today. 4 weeks and 1 day until the 2024 presidential election. The 1,371st day since convicted felon drooling J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. And day 2 after the Times realized something was wrong with Don. Use the election, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if we have to keep Trump from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news requires. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.